Well, hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's conversation on imaging the Earth today. I'm Manijeh Verghese, I'm the head of the AA Public Program, and tonight's event is a result of an open call that we launched as part of our Global Forum program on Earth Day, inviting AA staff, students, members, alumni, prospective students, friends, and beyond to submit an image or drawing that showed how they understand the Earth today. And we did this because it's a time when we're united in our experience of a global pandemic. And while we're physically separated, we're also more connected in platforms like this one than ever before. So a selection of the overwhelming volume of submissions that we received are available to view in a virtual gallery that you can enter through the AA website. And I'll post the link to that on the chat now. Everyone can see that. So tonight's event invites some of the authors of these incredible images and drawings to present their ideas to you and to discuss the role of drawing as a tool to understand the world around us, as well as the importance of imaging the Earth today. Joining us tonight, and I'll just go through the speakers in the order that they're going to present, are designers of the Virtual Earth Gallery, AA Diploma tutors, and founders of Space Popular, Fredrik, Hellberg, and Lara Lesmes. Then the founding member of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, artist and lifelong AA friend, Madelon Koolhaas-Vriesendorp. AA Council member and architect, Sam Jacob. Architect and AA Diploma tutor, David Kohn. And alumna, Marie-Louise Raue and Paul Francis Feeney of Feeney and Raue. And architect, artist, and AA first year tutor, Pol Esteve Castello. So the format of tonight's conversation will first be a tour of the virtual gallery by Fredrik and Lara, followed by short presentations by Maddie, Sam, David, Lisa, and Paul. After that, I'll ask some questions, during which time I encourage everyone in the audience to please post your questions in the chat box, and then we can unmute you to ask your question when we open up the conversation to the audience. So with that, I will hand over to Fredrik and Lara to get us started.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So we will share some images to give you a tour. Here. And
Play again.
yes.
Okay, so these are actually screenshots. We're not literally taking you through the gallery. You can visit it by clicking on the link. Should just say this is the first gallery we've ever designed before. It's quite a humbling task to design a gallery specifically for such amazing work that was submitted for this open call. Just firstly, this is the overall view of the whole gallery with the Earth. It kind of looks like a balloon almost, and coming closer, this is probably more recognizable for those of you who visit the gallery, with the Earth above this sort of crater-like internal radial gallery, which we designed so that the pictures will be visible from the center point where you enter, and which is this view that you would get. And just give a little bit of a background on what this is and how it came about. And it's done in a place that's commonly referred to in the industry as WebXR, which is really an intricate, complicated term. But we refer to it as what's called Immersive Internet, which is a term we use to describe basically a three-dimensional version of the internet, which is currently being built and which the AA Gallery is now a very small part of. This enormous three-dimensional place that no one owns, that is being built by people from all around the world, which essentially is, if you think about the internet like a map of a continent that we've never been to, this is the sort of moment when we actually go to the internet, when we can actually be in there. And we thought it was an amazing opportunity when they reached out about trying to create some kind of place for all this amazing work.
So yeah, when the AA asked us to do this, we said yes immediately, because we were really keen on start prototyping these kind of things. At the same time, we were thinking, like, is it actually a good idea to build a three-dimensional website to look at two-dimensional imagery? That it's a bit counterintuitive perhaps, and one could say, well, if the aim is to look at images, you might look much better at the images in a conventional two-dimensional website. However, just the possibility of bumping into each other was really exciting, and realizing that like part of the idea of going into a gallery is that potential for encountering somebody and being the AA Earth Gallery, potentially encountering somebody which to my bliss, it actually happened a few days ago, randomly going in with my family and encountering David in there as well, being there for the first time, which also speaks for the way these worlds are built, and the way this maybe makes sense to use these worlds is in a way in which they have an integrated format for a behavioral format or an activity, a very understandable program, so people kind of knows what to do with themselves, and also then there is the potential for other things to happen. Then the other really important thing is that this encountering other people, which we could say we are doing now over Zoom, is quite much more successful in spatial, in immersive web, because the very simple thing of having spatial audio, the fact that you can step aside and talk to somebody and have parallel conversations, or simply like be away from that person and still feel like you're in a public space because you are around other people that is doing the same thing you're doing. So we already spoke about the overall arrangement of the gallery itself, organized around the center. We also left permissions open to fly, so it's actually possible to go inside the Earth or to go and orbit around the Earth, which becomes quite a nice journey. And then the Earth itself is our very simple contribution. I think we're going to see a lot more interesting drawings today, but just to mention that is the Earth with a texture that is what it's called a normal map. So it's the normal Earth that we put in there. And just one last thought that we wanted to throw in there is that all of our projects before, all of them, and also the way in which we work with our students is with the thing that it says at the top. We usually work with future speculation of how these technologies are going to impact our society, because the impact that they have right now is almost inexistent. So we often work with what might happen when the hardware is at this stage, what might happen when the technology has reached a certain level. However, during these past few weeks, we have had, the energy to to experiment with prototypes and to make do with what's available right now. We were quite not so convinced about doing these sort of spaces that are experienced without the body, that are experienced through a screen. However, having experimented a little bit with this in the past few weeks has been quite encouraging, and we have discovered new properties that they have that have become quite interesting and encouraging. So I don't know, it's a new way of drawing space, perhaps. Yeah. That's what it is. We still don't know what to call it.
And we should maybe just add a final thing, that perhaps the reason why it looks so simple in terms of graphic terms is because it's done in a platform which is run by a non-profit, linking with the work we do with our students, considering, of course, now we all live our lives in the internet, and we think it's very important that we also kind of keep in mind the kind of internet or digital world that we're building, and that it's not just solely driven by these enormous tech companies.
Yeah, very important. It's built in Mozilla Hubs, which actually doesn't collect any data, and it's a non-profit organization. So every time anyone builds something, everyone should consider that we're voting for the platform in which we want these kind of things to happen. So yeah, I think that's all for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fredrik.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
Can we walk around this gallery?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a very good question. That's the whole purpose of this thing. So if you follow that link,
Where's the link is it?
in the chat.
You may not want to do it now while you are in a Zoom call.
No, I'm not doing it now. But
Yeah, we're very happy to take you on a tour, everyone who wants to join after this. And the whole point is that you'll be there like a little avatar, and you'll see through the eyes of that avatar, and we can talk to each other and walk around the gallery together.
Yeah, we can do the after party of the
Yeah. I mean, I guess this speaks for the problematics and how clumsy these things are. The fact that we're doing a Zoom call instead of it possibly being there, which speaks for how still basic.
We're doing the best we can.
Oh.
So, Maddie, do you actually want to go next and present your drawing?
Oh my God. I present my drawing. No, I made a caption, which when I reread it, I think I say to myself, what was I thinking? I was in a sort of a very furious trance about what was happening. And I thought the whole world is going to be taking over to, we have 40% of the wealth is now owned by a few, and they will have 99% of the wealth when we wake up from this nightmare, because they can now, and it's already happening. Chinese are already buying, companies that are failing. So, and this will happen. The people with money will own everything, and when the people are expelled from their houses, they will buy all the houses up. So these are all the screaming people who are in a terrible thing, and the other ones are just looking at the stars and waiting for this to end and make their big, financial gain. So that was what I was sort of saying in my thing. But I just looked at that we're thinking of the earth when in the moment that we actually want to leave it. And when our own little world has shrunk to sort of like the size of a nut. I mean, when I think, where shall I go today? It usually ends up the kitchen. And and my waist is enlarging massively. So it's difficult to talk about the earth at this moment, because we have no idea how bad it's going to be and how good it is going to be. A lot of people say it's fantastic for nature. Nature is doing so well and the air is so wonderful. But the moment, apparently, when we get in our cars, the air will be worse than it ever was, because nobody wants to go on public transport. Everybody wants to go in a car somewhere. And I'm definitely one of those. So, is my 10 minutes up? I hope. My 5 minutes, yes. No, I just looked up a lot of things about the earth, that we have so many expressions, and I looked up all the expressions, and they all sort of apply now, like it's hell on earth. Are we ever getting back to earth? Did we bring people down, to earth? What it'll all cost the earth? This is the end of the earth. We moved heaven and earth to survive this, and we were promised the earth. And where's the salt of the earth? Can we still make the earth move? Are we going to be wiped off the face of the earth? That's my contribution to this earth project, I'm afraid.
I think that was terrific, and I think it was a really nice way to frame the ways we use the earth, both in expressions as well as imagery. But what you were saying about the kitchen, being in your kitchen, and how hard it is to think of the earth, is a kind of great introduction to our next speaker, Sam, whose image was really about like the world kind of being shrunk inside our homes. So Sam, do you want to go next?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Maddie, you were an amazing warm-up act for me. Thank you so much. Because I've been thinking about this stuff so Well, obviously, like all of us, we're not thinking about it, but living it so much, you know, like, so this is something I'd started to make like before AA like kind of put out their call. And this is like just globes, obviously with interiors. They're called World of Interiors, obviously. Like worlds where no one is outside, everyone's inside, the whole planet has become an interior. And that's sort of the experience that many of us at least have had over the past, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 weeks, wherever you might be in the world. And it was also, you know, I also wrote something for Art Review about the experience of like, you know, what's happening to domestic space when you're in it all that time, the sort of stretch of the way time stretches, the way the kind of small interior seems to become so huge, so vast. So I've been thinking about like the world and the interior and the home. But I've also been thinking about, you know, kind of maps, plans and maps and stuff like that. And of course, like when we're imaging the world, like we often use it as a sort of like, we think of it as like a window on the world, you know, kind of in a transparent thing which we can use to understand the world. But you know, if we think about it, and of course most of us also know deep down that a map or an image of the world is not really an image of the world, it's an image of an idea of the world. So even when we're looking at what presents itself as like neutral information, like a Google map, it's, you know, seething with its own agendas of one kind or another, even as we're using it to get from one place to another. But you know, what do we use maps for when we're not going anywhere? So yeah, with that, those globes and that piece that I wrote, I started thinking, what about like imaginings of the world, like maps, which we might not recognize so much as maps of the world. This is the earliest known map of the world, a Babylonian map of the world. Of course, it's in the British Museum. Of course, it is. And it's just so wonderful. You know, it's like round, but it's not round like, you know, the planet is a sphere, not round like a globe. It's round because I don't know why it's round. Some kind of imagination. This is Wikipedia telling us what the little inscriptions might be. It's got these funny triangles that stick out to like, you know, distant lands. Oops. Here's another kind of interpretation of it, this time with the sky above it. I just thought like, oh my God, these such beautiful depictions of like, you know, the habitat of humanity. To look back, there's so many old maps which are just fascinating to look at, because they tell us not only about, you know, what people knew, but also about what people kind of felt and what they believed. Look at the bitter sea, big round like donut of the bitter sea. So fantastical. And of course, that the image of that map kind of lived on for a long time, even when people knew that the world didn't look like that. This is the T&O map, named because it looks like a T and a O, you know, kind of lived on into medieval times as this is what the world looked like. Unbelievable, and like really abstract. So I was thinking about that, like how to describe the whole world, and then to think about the home as when the home is your whole world. So I kind of made that drawing. So this is a drawing which is based on the Babylonian map of the world, but using some figures which you might recognize. So it's sort of made up of other drawings. So it's a kind of archaeology of architectural drawings. So it's a little bit of this, 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 like, you know, kind of a so yeah, it's a sort of a house that is the whole world, that's sort of in a way made out of the whole world, like not authored by me, but authored by a multitude. If anyone who's interested in talking more about maps or making maps, please, this is an advert by the way, please come and join us at the Desktop Design Academy on Friday. Follow Desktop Design Academy on Instagram for more details. Thank you.
I love maps. Yeah, I want to join, definitely.
Okay, I'll send you an email, Maddie.
You know this comedian Stephen Bright?
Yeah.
He said he had a map of the world at 1:1 scale.
I'll send you an email right now.
Thanks, Sam. I guess from thinking of the home and the world inside our homes to thinking of a kind of domestic craft of crocheting and how we kind of use that as a way to draw and image the earth, I can now pass on to David to talk about his drawing.
So yeah, I did 3 drawings, and the first was called Earth Day Crochet, and I've got some slides that just tell you the story of how this came about. So the first was, this is the brief that went out, and so I got this, what does this say, 25th of April. And so we'd been in lockdown already for a couple of weeks, and I was working from home. And of course that image makes you think of this one, which is the Earth Day flag. And that's in the center, the photograph taken from the Apollo 17 on December the 7th in 1972. And it's called the Blue Marble. And I guess it says something about the power of photography. It's now become one of the most disseminated images ever. And I mean, I was 2 months old when that was taken, and it gives you some kind of time span. And at home, the lockdown had meant for me starting a habit of doing a drawing in the morning. And I have a 6-year-old and 3-year-old daughters, Eva and Eleanor, and somehow this was kind of spirit lifting. It was about some kind of practice. I think it's cathartic, but also uplifting, maybe. And that was something to do with trying to establish a new rhythm. This is not something I did when I was in the office. And I suppose these have now become part of what I do every day. And the way of drawing was something to do with the ease of moving the hand over the page. That's about a kind of span of easy movement left and right. And in terms of the brief, then I began to think about this question of how everything is connected. And this idea of a crochet as a type of stitch that if you pull at it, it unravels the whole fabric. And this is some special characteristic to crochet and not to other forms of stitching. And I started to do these drawings that were every day a different version of, now I've got an idea of the earth, using the page here, the kind of center line of the page as a kind of equator if you turn it. And this was eventually the kind of text that I put with it, which was also, I think, trying to broaden what the practice of drawing every day might mean in terms of a practice as an architect. More broadly. And I remembered reading, I think I went to an exhibition called Sempering in Milan in 2016, and it was all about the impact of Semper, 150 years later. And I looked up the kind of quote from it, and it said, so this is Semper writing in 1862, that crochet is a type of stitch with a powerful characteristic. If untied, it causes the whole system to unravel. And this was in the context of him trying to come up with universal ideas for architecture. And apparently he'd been to the Great Exhibition in 1851 after he'd written his first treatise on a kind of encyclopedia of architecture, and he'd come across this building, which was a Caribbean hut, and he went on to write his most famous treatise about this little building, thinking that it epitomized the kind of 4 aspects of architecture that would be weaving, ceramics, carpentry, and stereotomy, so like carving out of like stone, for example. And that I think the reason this was still interesting in 2016, because of this sense that the concept of architecture can't entirely replace an idea of craft, of making, of and the idea of weaving as something intimately connected to a practice. And as architects working in the world, this felt like a way of connecting the kind of efforts on a page to a broader practice. And I thought what was a project that we'd done that might connect all these ideas together. And this is a pavilion in the V&A for the photography centre that was in the shape of a tent. And it was actually all of the V&A was built off the ticket proceeds from the Great Exhibition. And we were interested in, when making this pavilion, that the history of photography was related to the history of spaces around creating prints using light and the kind of chemical fixing requiring a darkened space. And this was the first ever dark room, was a dark tent that you would travel with. So this idea of exploration and expedition being intimately connected to the history of photography. And so bringing back this kind of feeling like in our lives and at the moment, in every aspect of what we do, there's this kind of growing awareness of you just can't get away from the fact that everything is connected. And if you pull at one corner, it starts to ripple through and affect everything else. Thank you. So if I go.
Thanks, David. So I guess this is great without planning it. Every speaker is kind of introducing the next one. So on the note of everything is connected, Feeney and Raue are going to talk about a very kind of iconic image from a publication that one of our other speakers was one of the main contributors to, Delirious New York, a retroactive manifesto. So they're going to talk about their riff on an image from that book.
So this iconic original drawing to us represents the world of our recent past, freedom. Our world was one giant social situation. We were the naked individuals slurping our oysters whilst wearing sweaty boxing gloves. Why? Did eating out of the glove pronounce the taste? Did the struggle make it more rewarding? It did not matter. We were living it. A scene unfolds in front of our eyes about the collective human vitality that thrives in architecture. Light dramatically sets the scene. Where the light comes from, we don't know. Like a stage, it's somewhat artificial. Later, these self-obsessed, unsanitized, schlemmer-like actors might descend into the rest of the metropolis, undoubtedly full of raw and real experiences.
The new image represents the world of today. All of a sudden, life is totally unspectacular, a still life without life. The absence of humans renders the scene vacuous. The spirit of congestion is temporarily dead, giving way to a certain spatial serenity. Where are the actors? Are they elsewhere, living a much more controlled existence? Are they still obsessed with the old world? Are they satisfying their old habits by playing the online Xbox from home, getting oysters delivered, all from the comfort of their own respective living rooms? Having surrendered our individual liberties in favor of the collective, we are all suddenly confined yet paradoxically liberated. In our rationed existence, rituals and routines have emerged that let us see the world in a new light. Today, we might find delight in the simplest of things. So the question for us remains, when the dust settles, will we return to the first iconic image, the old world as we knew it, or will we simply turn off the lights? Thank you.
Sometime I will tell you the real background of that drawing.
Cannot wait. Okay.
Well, thanks. And I think that has to be the first point of the discussion, to find out the real story behind that image. But before that, we go on to our, I guess, final presenter, Pol, who is going to take us from the very small to the very large. As a kind of way to maybe zoom in and out of this discussion.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I will keep my camera off because my connection is rather unstable. So I will share the image of my drawing and I will talk over it. I hope you can now see the image.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So the drawing I presented was titled The Destiny of the World, and it addressed the close set of relationships existing between the earth and the human body, between the macro and the micro, like Manijeh was saying, between the global and the self. It departs from the understanding that it is not possible to depict the earth without explicitly or implicitly depict the body, or the other way around, that the earth can actually be portrayed through the mapping of the body. The body has been understood as a cultural archive, an entity that has a performative and a biopolitical status. The body is the receptacle in which the physical, social, and political conditions that conform the earth are inscribed and somatized. The body condenses, carries, and produces the relationships of power and desire that configure our inhabitable spaces as we know them. Body's external attributes, chemical composition, and even gestures can be read as the legend to a map of the world. The body's gender, racial, and ethnical characters translate into national and social borders that can be spatially and geometrically traced. The presence of certain molecules in our lungs and in our blood can reveal atmospheric and productive landscapes composed of factories and farms, pollen, fumes, and pesticides. Our finger gestures, learned in contact with a tactile screen, reveal vast infrastructures of audiovisual consumption, networks of information that travel on electromagnetic waves beyond the stratosphere. The drawing I present also draws on the notion of pornography. It inquires on the regimes of representation, which is to say on the forms of production, distribution, and consumption of images. The original fragments that later compose the collage drawing will generally be considered pornographic and therefore unsuited for certain publics. But after a bit of freestyle Photoshop, twisting some pixels, they appear as acceptable. In that sense, the drawing interrogates the social and juridical conventions that regulate the access to certain forms of representation, the eventual forms of control and censorship that segregate the gaze and that might make us blind to portions of the earth. Finally, and going back to the title of the drawing, which is The Destiny of the World, it implicitly refers to the present condition in which it is undissociable to link the notion of the earth from a certain notion of futurability. Mapping or drawing the earth seems undissociable from imagining its future, and too often a concerning future. All sorts of predictions envisioning social and climatic catastrophic destinies populate our imaginary of the earth. However, I do believe that the earth is a yet to come, and therefore full of potentialities rooted in our present. As formally exposed, if revealing the micropolitics of the body is unveiling the macropolitics of the world, transforming the micropolitics of the body might have the potential to transform the world. Imagining other material and discursive practices around the body is imagining another planet Earth. Thank you. And now I'm coming back to you. Hello.
Great. So thank you everyone for a really terrific set of presentations and a very diverse array of images, which we kind of selected to be part of this panel discussion because they kind of traverse different scales, different attitudes towards image and drawings. They talked about the body in different ways, the home, the act of drawing. And I think in all the presentations, we really spanned a range of themes that kind of also connected the different ideas behind them, from the idea of authorship, ownership, systems, kind of cultural values that we associate with the earth, our interconnectedness, scale, and then I guess this idea of mapping or drawing. And I wanted to kind of maybe start the discussion by maybe asking about authorship. And maybe that comes back to this, one of the questions that we framed tonight's discussion with in terms of how we use drawing as a tool as artists and architects. Because I think Fredrik and Lara in the first presentation hit on this idea of the internet as a kind of collectively authored project and the importance of things being open source. The earth was kind of, I mean, barring the kind of religious narrative that God made the earth, it was not I guess, authored by any one individual. And I think as so many of the drawings show, David, in yours, you talk about the kind of the system and the interconnectedness and how you pull at these stitches and then the whole system unravels. And so I was wondering if any of you kind of wanted to comment on the idea of authorship, like the authorship of the individual drawing, and then the kind of understanding of the earth as a wider system.
I mean, I guess the thing I made was like explicitly using other people's drawings, like, and it's like I love doing that. I've been doing it like myself, been doing it with my students. I was doing it at the same time I'd set the same exercise to a bunch of students in Stuttgart that I'm working with this semester, and that, like, basically taking drawings apart which were made in whatever medium, using Photoshop and Illustrator to kind of remake them, basically. And it's just like such an interesting way to use like contemporary tools, interrogating like all of the kinds of things which you associate with like authorship, like, you know, the quality of a line, all of those kinds of things. So it's sort of messing around with the authorship. But I wanted to ask Maddie, like, did you do that drawing in the first place? And how do you, if you did, like, how do you feel about
I did that drawing, but it was just to explain that 3 things could happen in a place in the Downtown Athletic Club in New York. So he explained it that you could be because the locker rooms were right next to an oyster bar. So he said the possibility there is that people have been boxing, because there was a boxing ring nearby as well. They can, you know, after boxing, they can get undressed, or just before they get dressed, they can go with their boxing gloves on to eat oysters in the bar next door. And then Rem asked me, can you make a drawing of it? I said, no way. And then he said, well, here, look at Tom of Finland. Make one Tom of Finland drawing of this scene. And so I said, okay, I'll do it, but you have to promise never to tell anyone that I did it. You have to pretend that you found it in one of those, you know, gay drawing booklets and everything. But anyway, so the moment there was a guy who was, what is Hellberg? He had the Architect. What was the magazine he did? I think it was called The Architect. And he said to Rem, we were having dinner there, and he said to Rem, who did that drawing? And he said, oh, Maddie did it. Immediately, without thinking 1 minute. So this was immediately out in the open. Rem, you promised. Oh, yes, sorry. that was the end of that.
But how do you feel about like having it doctored and like
perfect. No, but I had my, you know, there was a guy in Japan who did a competition, and he used my painting from the front, the Builders in Bed Together, and he did some manipulation of it, and then he won the competition. And then somebody said, ooh, this is not your drawing or something, and the prize was taken away from him. And I was so against it, because I put it out in the public. I think anybody can do what they want with it. And they all did. Some people put other builders in bed, and everybody manipulated. Why not him, you know? It was very upsetting. I think the moment you publicize something, it's in the public realm. You can use it, you can cut it, you can... I don't believe in this sort of authorship or authenticism. What do you call it? Authenticity. I can't remember. I don't know what the word is, but.
No, but I think that's a really interesting.
Because you always use everything you've ever seen. You know, nothing you do is authentic. I don't believe in it. Everybody should be able to use everything.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I guess when Lisa and Paul were making the drawing, I don't know if they anticipated that we would put them in a conversation with you, but I think in a way that conversation began by them kind of remaking that drawing and making a commentary on what's happening right now through like an iconic image like that. Do you guys want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we never noticed in the image, and I know this is a very simple thing, but it's the light. It's the light in the room. Yeah. It just doesn't really make much sense, but when you have the three naked people there, it seems to kind of dominate the image. And then as soon as you kind of remove these people, you really see this strange scene. And we were just curious how you even formulated this scene.
The lockers had to be in there, and the table, and this, and the boxing gloves and the oysters. So.
And was this in your mind, or
the guys were just an addition to the story?
Was it
important?
We read that it was a reference of some kind of gay magazines.
Yeah, she said that.
Yeah. But, okay.
Totally gay magazine thing, yeah. And there were people who made incredible. I went into a secondhand bookstore in Amsterdam, and I looked at, there was a Deleuze New York, and the guy said, I said, oh, interesting, how much is it? And he said, that book? That book was made for gay people. So, he had this whole theory that this book was just to get to explain the whole sort of gay New York. It was very funny.
Yeah.
It was an interesting experience to actually really redraw it. I've never really done this. I mean, we were strategizing in the beginning, like, can we Photoshop them out? How do we do this? Can we brush the texture? Impossible. The light would change if they're gone. How do we do this? So we have to redraw it basically. And then it's like, what paper? How do we do this? And it's quite interesting because you have to, we have to hatch the whole thing again. And then it's like, where is it dark? Where is it light? It's funny that I think you look at, I will never look the same way at this image again. It was almost like a nice struggle to remake it in a weird way.
There's a lot of very interesting and creative stuff going on now. That people have, Jesus at the Last Supper, all by himself, and there's a whole book where this book's called Find Willy. Where's Willy?
Yeah.
Wally? Yeah. Is he Wally or Willy? Now I'm so into Willy's. It was Wally probably.
Yeah.
Wally, and there's a whole book where Wally is all alone in the street, all alone. In every page there's Wally alone. It was so brilliant. So
yeah, but I think
that was inspired by taking things away from crowds.
Yeah, I think it's a real theme across a lot of the drawings in tonight's conversation. The kind of idea of the body in space, and the lack of bodies around it. I think quite a few I think from Fredrik and Lara talking about spatial audio and how these platforms limit us from really feeling like we're in a space with other bodies, unless you manage to create something that actually doesn't necessarily simulate a physical space, but simulates the experience of being with other people, which you can experience in their virtual gallery. Or I guess Pol in the last presentation talking about the body as a kind of microcosm of the world and how so much of the world can be understood through the body, to, I guess, Feeney and Raue, like you guys removing the people from space and seeing the impact that has on the image. So yeah, I thought that was a really a thread that connected the different images and presentations together. And I was just wondering, like, how making these images may help us think through the aftermath of this, which is something, Maddie, you touched on in your image, like what happens when the world reopens? Like, do we all go back to being a kind of incredibly polluted, very dense space? Or are we in this very liberated moment right now to rethink our relationship to one another and how we occupy public space?
That assumes that we have any power over it, and the people with the money are the only one with power. So we can decide what we want, and we'll never have a voice. we can decide to let nature run its course and, you know, to stop logging, but the people who are now starving, they will log even more, you know. It's
I guess but I guess yes, the people in power kind of like that power structure is being perpetuated, but I mean, maybe Fredrik and Lara, for you to comment on like the choice of using open source platform to kind of maybe prevent like a certain one platform that's like kind of making all the money from this crisis, like from dominating the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's you know, the parallel universe that we all now spend a lot of our time living in, and the way that we interact with each other now. Of course, that whole dynamic, Maddie, that you're talking about, it's like flipped upside down and so immeasurably more complex with these kind of platforms that we're using right now. And I think this is something that we've been trying to deal with for a while, but that has obviously gotten a sort of extra push now when we realize that obviously the way we're connecting now, I mean, it's a human right that we had like really bad internet in the beginning of the lockdown. And I literally almost had my first panic attack in my life. You know, like the supermarket was half empty and I was like, we're locked down and the internet's not going to work. That's not going to work. I mean, and then I'm really going to flip out. And it's not just about our work dealing with these topics, but it's just literally the only way we have to connect with each other now. And of course,
he didn't have a panic attack.
I said almost. Yeah, but I mean,
closest you could get to it.
Yeah, but obviously this whole situation and the kind of technological situation we find ourselves in, and the complexities with us, it's obviously come to extra light now at the moment. But it's all the technology and all these things we're using, they're built for a world that were normal, so to speak, right? These things were not built in preparation for this. So,
and I think, Maddie, you're saying that we don't have any control and so on. Well, I think we can use the little bit of, or we don't have any power. Now, the little bit of power that we have is making those decisions. Right now, we are all voting for Zoom by joining this call in this way, right? Of course, it's very hard to sabotage things once they have become generalized, like we have seen with social media. But maybe as we step into these other platforms that allow for these three-dimensional spaces that now very few people cares for, maybe like our very small mission is like, if we can convince enough people to make a safe choice rather than joining the most convenient one when eventually some of them do, then that's the thing we would have gained, or like consciously used our very little power for, which is the things we choose to use, or the things we choose to buy. Every little one of those decisions is a vote.
Because it's quite amazing that the platform where the AA Earth Gallery exists on is literally run by like 5 people that we're all in like just Twitter contact with. When you get to that level, the world is actually quite small and people have a lot of power, or not power, maybe not the right word, but a lot of influence in shaping.
They are using the little power they have. So yeah. Maybe that's a bit of a self-defeatist way of looking at it, but yeah.
I mean, maybe to just bring David in, because I know you have to leave quite soon. The idea, I mean, behind your drawings of the crochet stitch being like the thing that could quickly unravel the whole system. So if the virus is the thing that unraveled the system now, what are other ways, building onto this kind of discussion, that that individuals could unravel the system or disrupt the kind of existing power structures in place?
Well, I suppose, I mean, of course, it's difficult to argue against the idea that one has limited power. So I guess, I think the one thing that, one use of drawing might be to form a practice that is resistant to certain inevitabilities, and maybe also to find things that are continuous. So I still feel like, I mean, one thing that I've noticed in terms of how the practice functions, you know, we have to kind of reimagine how we do the things that we did before. It's no, you know, we can't design in the same way, but we know that we need to design. And I think maybe this kind of interest in sustaining some connection between the largest and the smallest things, between, I guess, global questions of, thinking about kind of making buildings as still having currency next year. There's still the question of how does one relearn, in a way, in this kind of where the status quo seems to have just completely collapsed. How does one relearn in the new context how to continue those things of value within what we do? And I suppose drawing has historically been, and I suppose in a way by doing hand drawings, it's kind of, I suppose, an argument for the continued relevance of something modest and daily that might build on past knowledge that's still relevant. I mean, a lot is changing and a lot will be irrelevant, but many things need to be updated, rethought, and I think it's both kind of exhilarating and terrifying, and it's kind of trying to make the most of what is undoubtedly a very difficult situation, and for a very difficult situation for a lot of people, as Maddie's pointed out. That's that's kind of in doing the research around kind of 1851, and this kind of this interest in bringing exotic architectures to London, and this, in a way, we're still in a kind of weird 19th century situation that still hasn't been challenged, and maybe this is going to be a kind of reckoning in terms of a lot of narratives that have kind of remained quite continuous. So it's what of that is still relevant and what isn't, and it's holding on to the threads that are still relevant.
Yeah, and potentially who are the new audiences for architecture when this is all over. And I think when we saw your submissions for this, I thought they were really fascinating. And then I've since seen on Instagram that you shared like a wider series of them. And there's like a whole other audience for them that maybe overlaps with the people who are already the audience for your practice, or maybe there's a completely new audience for that. I don't know. But I think something that you said, Paul, in your presentation was that you took all these images that weren't appropriate maybe for public viewing or for certain publics, and then through adding them together and through kind of recontextualizing them with the earth, they suddenly became acceptable. And I think that also ties into this idea of creating new audiences or taking images from one particular set of audiences and then making it more public. And I didn't know if you wanted to comment more on that.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, definitely. I think actually the production of a drawing, let's say, or of an image, if you want to call it like this, the process of production, actually distribution and consumption is actually what defines almost this image as well, no? And it's not the same, for instance, a drawing in the 70s published in a magazine than a drawing nowadays published in Instagram, no? So I think the power that had actually of affecting people, actually of convincing the publication of a drawing in the mass media, for instance, at the beginning of this mass media, it's not actually the power that they have at the present. No? So definitely I think there is a lost power of the drawing to a certain extent, or a transformed power of the drawing in the terms it's consumed nowadays. But beyond that, when I was referring to pornography, I was not only meaning about sexuality, no, but what kind of images are allowed to be seen and which kind of images are not allowed to be seen. So what images from satellites that are being produced we will never be able to see, or what kind of images that are produced by the military or any other institutions actually that might be producing certain images that we don't have access to them, and what kind of knowledge do these images produce and what are we missing actually. No? So I think that there is a question of how do we legally regulate the production and consumption of images that goes across many different institutional and social practices, that it's one thing to question. No? And well, I don't know if this more or less was answering the question, but
Yeah,
Definitely, yeah, and maybe also something that I wanted to mention when you were talking about the authorship, that I think is also related with all this vast system of production of images, no, audiovisual materials and cultural materials, is that I think it was an example, no, out of the submissions that we presented here today, at least more than half of them are built up on pre-existing materials. And I think it's impossible almost nowadays to actually produce an image without building up on the vast amount of audiovisual imaginary that it's already out there. No? It's wherever you do, it already almost exists, no? Or exists in a similar form that obviously can be transformed, can be adequate, it can be recontextualized and stretched or manipulated through the pixeling, as I did. No, but definitely there is this vast ocean of materials that are floating around us, and we cannot do anything else than actually jump into it and use it. No?
Maybe that's no different to the situation that David was describing of Semper in this like gigantic new kind of building, new kind of experience, looking at a reconstruction of something which was thought of as being kind of, you know, authentic. So no one knows if what he was looking at was like, you know, some guys in Sydenham had just decided they would try and build something which looked like, you know, came from somewhere else, whether that's true or not. Just the fact that so much was collected and displayed in front of this Victorian audience, you know, there's already, you know, like about over 100 years ago, this accumulation of cultural material, which is inspiring new readings and so on and so forth. So I know we often feel that, you know, our situation is kind of more extreme, but in a sense, that's always the situation. It always feels like you're at the end of history, that everything has been done, that there's this accumulation. But I do agree that we do have maybe a different relationship, because now we can get it all, you know, without having to look very hard. We don't have to be like Archigram and Super Studio with our special little piles of magazines, which are very precious because we can't make our collages without them. We can just go, yeah, we'll get it. So in a sense, that becomes much more creative. I think there's so much more possibility to work with, you know, found images, but also the way that we can intervene in them. If Super Studio, all they had was a scalpel, we've got like incredible, you know, tools that can take us deep inside the image, just as I think you were talking about too. It's like we can go right into them, down to the sort of pixel level. So I think that does transform how we can work with found material.
But I guess it's also the understanding of something as found or not necessarily factual. Like I think, Sam, in your presentation, when you were talking about Google Earth and that, you know, that there's so much intent behind something that we just think of as well, a lot of us think of as neutral or factual. So I was a student of mine several years ago, did a project on Grenfell, or a few years ago, did a project on Grenfell Tower. And shortly after the fire, they replaced the street view image of Grenfell with the kind of burnt tower. And then when the investigation started, they replaced it with the kind of tower before the fire. So you couldn't actually see reality there. And that's when you realize, I guess, what, Paul, you were talking about, this kind of doctoring of imagery, and it kind of returns to Maddie's point about who's in power and who controls what we see on these like publicly accessible platforms on the internet. So I don't know, I just felt like that kind of stitched together a lot of the points that have been raised in the discussion. The chat is very quiet, so if anyone from the audience has a question, please send it to me and I'll ask it. Otherwise, I can continue asking questions, you know, for the whole time that we have left. But I was wondering if any on the panel had questions for each other beyond what you've already asked.
I mean, Sam's thought there about, you know, the kind of continuous history of available images. I'm kind of interested connecting that to Fredrik and Lara's kind of investment in kind of digital space, and I guess increasing dependence on algorithms to generate content, and this kind of moment at which kind of images will generate themselves and drawings will kind of auto produce. I mean, there's this kind of interesting the kind of internet brain where you have access to every image, and you know, we can work so fast, and then we might want help. I'm kind of curious how much of that we'll begin to see a kind of combination of things that are self-combining. Obviously, computer games rely on a certain amount of constant generation.
I mean, that's already the way that most of these platforms are built. When they create an easy way for people to create worlds, is built in the assumption that that people is going to pull together, in this case, 3D models, and make them available. So that, and there is a lot of interesting terms that they use, like if you upload something and you can, to give permission for people to use it, it's called allow remixing.
Oh, right.
So the whole terminology, I think the issue with we're gonna really have to confront the way
we did in the olden days. Everybody allowed remixing. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans.
Yeah, like you were saying,
remixed everything.
I think the problem, the only issue with authorship has mainly to do with the fact that we, in which the art has capitalized on authorship, and the manipulation of that. So I don't know.
It's our obsession with celebrity. Everybody has to put a name on everything. I hope after this, complete reality rebellion by the self-servitives, I call them self-servitives now, that there will be a whole thing against celebrity, the whole thing, a shift in what is important and what is not. That's what I'm hoping for.
But you already see that actually in connecting here with what David was asking. If you look beyond art and look beyond architecture and design and into the other fields that are creating this amazing world, like gaming, for instance, there is there is a kind of celebrity culture and a kind of authorship around key people that are building amazing things. But by and large, there are just enormous amounts of people that are doing beautiful things. And if you search really hard, you might find like a kind of nickname or something on some obscure streaming website. Yeah. There's this kind of subculture around that's infinitely more productive than I think we are, certainly that we are anyway. But it's interesting to see that it's not just a kind of big step. I mean, if we look back at the kind of Great Exhibition and onwards, it's a kind of gradual curve that everything kind of connects. And I just the other day, which I would recommend you to do if you have a spare moment, went back into an old hard drive to find my first traces of my first computer trace, like the first files I ever generated and the first things I ever downloaded online, which is like from 95 or something. And I remember I saw those images again, and I remember them all when it was just, it's not so long ago. It was from 96, 97. And from there, it's not like a giant step. It's a gradual curve of a change in how we distribute and we find images. And I don't think there has not been a tipping point when it's gone from something kind of wonderful to something dangerous. It's all.
Yeah, but Maddie, on the point of authorship, did you have a moment when you overcame the fear of losing authorship, or have you always felt this way about your work? Like, anyone can use it, it's fine.
No, I find that if my name is not on the thing, I don't mind. But if somebody else's name is on it, then of course I do mind. If it's completely my picture.
Yeah, obviously.
So, it's very simple, but I think anybody can take it and manipulate it. And I applaud Marie-Louise for doing that.
Yeah, no, I was wondering if there was a moment of turning point, because it's rather unusual for an artist to feel that way. And I personally feel that I am coming to this point now, maybe by being within this, building this sort of spaces and realizing that like everyone is contributing. Why don't I click the allow remixing? Yeah. Why wouldn't I? No, if it relies, does it rely on this? Like it's almost becoming a very ideological decision. Like again, what am I voting for by doing this?
Yeah, and we were Lara's built also these kinds of spaces like the gallery for her niece and nephew that David you met in the gallery to play hide and seek or for birthday parties, and the kind of behavior of the community of people that build this sort of world. They were like, well, just make it available to all of us.
Can I have it?
Can I have it?
I was like, well, world. Can you have it? I don't, yes, I guess you should have it. But I must say that it was a bit of a turning point. Like, yeah, yes. And then, yeah.
But refreshing.
Yeah.
There were some parts in New York that were made, they were available, and somebody sent them to me that took the two buildings, and they went in a cart going around the city, and they had all kind of other situations they were in, apart from in the bed, you know. So they took the two buildings and went on, and they said, don't you need to tell them that no, it's not my buildings. When I see them, I think, yeah, they're mine. But
so we have a question from the audience. I'm just going to unmute them. So
Hi, everybody. My name is Hanneke. Thank you for your comments and the discussion. I was curious with this question of authorship, also maybe signature or developing a style in your work that's somehow instantly recognizable, and whether or not to refute that sort of pursuit of originality, both in architectural drawing and maybe more artistic. So it's maybe not a fully formed question, but I thought that was an interesting kind of point to bring into this discussion of authorship.
No, these are movements. I mean, in art as well, there are movements. Everybody started to suddenly do dots on their paintings, and nobody said, hey, these dots, those are mine, you know. I mean,
I completely agree. I think the idea of like aiming for originality is a trap. And the more you understand yourself in the context, in some context, and realize that you're not the sole author and that you're probably part of some kind of movement, even if it doesn't have a name, is actually very liberating.
And look at Picasso. He did every single style you could think of.
Yeah.
And he had a thing that if he said, if you're an artist, a bad artist, he copies, but a real artist steals.
But in relationship maybe with the increased use of social networks or presence online, that maybe solidifies as a more specific identity. You know, like you have a name, you have one profile, and you are that, and you cannot be multiple, like you could be in your real life. I'm actually fighting to not be identified as one single thing. And I think it has to do actually with this idea of having maybe a style or having a particular way of doing things that people can recognize in you. For instance, my name has two surnames. I'm Pol Esteve Castelló, and sometimes by mistake completely, they say me Pol Esteve, some other times Pol Castelló. And then I thought, actually, maybe I should embrace this. So I should embrace that sometimes I'm Pol Esteve, sometimes I'm Pol Castelló. I have more than one Instagram account. So I'm not one single person, but I can be multiple ones. And why actually do I want to reduce myself into one single thing? Sometimes it's difficult because you can only produce certain things. I mean, you cannot be everyone at the same time. No? So sometimes, obviously, you can recognize yourself in your drawings, you can recognize yourself in your designs as an architect, and it's difficult to escape yourself to a certain extent. But as much as I can, for instance, I prefer to leave it behind.
I think like Go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, one thought on this kind of multiple authorship question is, I mean, increasingly, we're aware in practice around who's at the table and who has a voice, that the outcomes in dealing with extremely complex situations are only improved by the earlier you talk to everyone else and the more diverse your team, the faster you move into territory that you didn't anticipate when you were trying to reach the limits of your options on your own. And so I suppose, as it feels like, I mean, we feel like we're being asked to do, and maybe every generation does, that the next project is something you haven't done and you need to somehow extend beyond what you think is possible. that's when I think the collaboration really comes into its own. And I suppose it's only a case of acknowledging that is the difference between the reality of practice and the image of practice. I mean, if you try and trace back the moment in which a project congeals to the actors and who said what, it is never this kind of flash. There's always this preamble and several people, and a kind of the person who's given the space to make a decision was given the space by a lot of other people. And maybe it's just that acknowledgement that's a bit timely.
So I always feel that if you are already in a room with many people, they all influence you. I don't believe in this separation of what this one did that. Mm-hmm. In a lot of offices, they say, yeah, she works in the office of Corbusier, but it was really her who, no, without Corbusier, she would have never designed it. So it's always, collaboration is always some teamwork. It's never one person who's really done it.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the question, Maddie, you talked about authenticity at the beginning. Like, there's a sort of myth of authenticity of the self. You could say authenticity of the artist or the designer or the architect, which is absolutely manufactured. It's not real. Like, and is part of you could say like an ideology that requires signatures, requires Picasso, maybe, yeah, many styles, but always a signature. Like, why always the signature? You know, like, why always write your bloody name on your painting you've just done? It's like, don't, you know, like that is, and that's very important in terms of a kind of, it's like provenance, in terms of value, all of those kinds of things. If you refuse to participate, if you do say, no, I'm going to have 2 names, 3 names, 4 names, 7 Instagram accounts, like, you know, then you can begin to, I guess, unravel a little bit, or at least pull a little bit at the crochet.
Diversify yourself.
Yeah. So yeah, and you know, within architecture, that's true on a cultural level, but it's especially true on a professional level, where you need to always be presenting this kind of, you know, professional kind of appearance. That needs to be so authentic that you have your, you know, insurance documents, your like other, you know, ISO certificates, like all of these kinds of things, in order to convince someone that you can do the job, or that your team, the many, can do the job.
Repeat yourself, please. Repeat yourself. Push the repeat button. Then people know what you're doing.
But I mean, it's also, I guess it's fair to say that sort of not relying on authorship is almost a privilege, because that means that you can also, you don't need to live off claiming that authorship. And I think that's mostly, like, I think most people might not maybe ideologically feel like it's mine and it has to be mine, but more like, well, if this is what I do, and if this is very simply like what I'm going to live off, then I better make sure that people know that it's me, so they come back to me. So I think that's the fine balance, where also, like, when, or at least I feel when I try to think in these other ways and like promote a practice that works in a less authoring, claiming kind of way, it's also considering, well, can I do this because I maybe somehow have managed to have that privilege where I know it's going to revert back to me anyway, or I mean, that's, I guess, at the core of it is a very practical question. I was like, is this what you do for a living? And therefore it might be quite convenient to really fully author it.
But we're totally also kind of guilty of this whole brand junkie thing.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, like, we're not in any, it's just an interesting thing because we connect to this world where it's so different, but we're clearly like also
not anonymous in any way.
No, it's young designers and architects in a world where, like, it kind of, well, there's many ways to do it, but at least the way we're doing it kind of matters a bit, you know, like that you have some kind of authorship over your work, and that's how it spreads. It's a complex thing.
I mean, I guess it all comes down to words and vocabulary, and whether one is kind of like authorship. Not claiming authorship doesn't mean that you need to go to some kind of anonymity. So I guess it again, as all these discussions always have to do with the choice of wording And I don't know if really what we're talking about is authorship or the claiming of such, or if there is a better word for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a comment that's come in that is questioning whether it's about authorship or ownership, because there could be multiple authors, but then there's this need through intellectual property and things like that to like own something, or to be paid, be paid royalties, or to charge someone to use an image. And I thought that was an interesting point that's come up about the difference between, you know, being an author or a co-author and owning something, and owning an image or a drawing or a style.
Thank you to whoever said that is the word. At least that's what I was talking about, not authorship. No.
Anna, you wanted to say something. I saw your lips move before.
Yeah.
Anna, you unmute.
Unmute yourself. She can't. You have to.
I'll do it. 1 second.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's really interesting how if you look at historic maps, they've always been very much about one kind of person or one society's view of what the earth is. And actually maybe now in this kind of collective time that we live in with multiple authors for everything, maybe actually it should be a crowdsourced map of the earth where everyone adds in their versions of what they think it should be, rather than one person or Google telling us what the earth is.
Yeah. That's interesting. Like, who owns that image, David, that you showed, which was like that photo of the earth, which, I don't know, people say changed many people's conception of the world. Like,
it's Wikipedia. It's NASA took it. I did search for what collection it was in, because I was slightly wondering whether it was in the V&A's photography collection, which would be another, but it's not. So I assume it's owned by NASA still.
Yeah. But like, yeah, go ahead.
No, go for it, Sam.
Oh yeah, but you know, when it appears on the front of the Whole Earth catalogue, it kind of represents something. And the kind of circulation of an image like that, which has such a significance, is maybe, Anna, what you're talking about is like, it's not just the kind of function of the map, but it's the kind of like what the map represents in a sense. Like our vision of what a world is also what, you know, making a map is also a way of designing a world, and making an image of the planet is a way of imagining what kind of planet we might want to be on. And, you know, maps are, in that sense, incredibly powerful things. You know, the histories of maps, like the origin of the British Ordnance Survey maps, are military. It's like comes first from needing to know the terrain in the Scottish Highlands in order to suppress the clans, or the mapping of Ireland, which was to suppress the Irish. And, you know, maps in that case are a kind of, you know, they're a military technology. But maps also can liberate us. Maps can also help us solve problems. They can, you know, find the source of cholera in the West End, or they can maybe help us visualize problems like issues to do with climate change. So I think the act of making maps, which is perhaps also making images of the world, is a way of reimagining what that world might be, which is sort of what the function of the image which you were beginning with, David, like a picture of the world which can change the world in a sense.
Yeah, so on the chat, several audience members are telling us that the blue marble is a public domain image, and most NASA images are public domain, but they need proper citation. And someone else has said that it's interesting because it's actually is itself a composite image, so you can see kind of Photoshop repetitions. But I think, Sam, your point is a kind of nice way to conclude, in that I don't know, there's all this power to maps, and the need to make images of ourselves and to understand the earth and its boundaries. And earlier on in the chat, there was a comment about kind of why we all universally accept like one form for the earth, that, you know, right now it's the sphere, but, you know, before it was this understanding that it was flat, but that these kind of unconventional ways of understanding the earth, or as Anna was saying, this kind of moving image that's kind of crowdsourced and constantly changing, is maybe more accurate. than this kind of fixed geometry that we tend to see it as. But I don't know, there were so many interesting points raised in today's discussion, and I think it's given us all a lot of food for thought. But I would like to thank everyone for presenting and everyone who attended, and invite you all to go and experience the virtual gallery if you haven't already. And a big thank you to Anna for organizing this as well.
Thank you.
I'll just unmute everyone quickly so we can join the clap.